The woman he abandoned for being too ordinary just walked in wearing a U.S. Army uniform with triplets. Grace Miller stepped into the marble lobby of Orion Tech. Combat boots, pressed uniform, eyes forward. Her three daughters gripped her hands, moving as one. Every conversation stopped. CEO Logan Walker turned from the stage. His voice cracked mid-sentence. His past stared straight at him. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Their eyes locked. 10 years collapsed in that moment. A whisper spread like wildfire. Wait, is that Grace? Logan's fingers trembled. He wasn't ready for this, but she was. Before the silence. Before the uniform, there was laughter in small dorm rooms, midnight noodles, cheap coffee, hands held under shared textbooks. Grace wore oversized hoodies and always carried a notebook. Logan loved how she underlined every quote that moved her. He once said, you're going to change the world, you know that? She smiled. Not the world, just mine. He walked her home through snowy sidewalks. She waited outside his eggings with warm drinks. They dreamed out loud, a house, a dog, maybe kids someday. He was her first real love. And she was the only person who believed in him before the title, the suits, the success. In those days, everything felt possible. They didn't know what was coming. Not yet. Grace sat on the edge of their small bed, holding the test. 2 lines, clear, undeniable. Logan walked in, still laughing about a class presentation. She looked up, quiet. He paused. What's wrong? She handed him the test. No words, just a shaky breath. He stared, then looked at her. We're having a baby? Grace nodded, eyes full. Tears fell before she could stop them. He sat beside her, arms wrapping tight. Her head rested on his chest. Silence. Then a whisper. I didn't think it'd be now, he said. I didn't either, she replied. But I'm happy. He kissed her forehead, tried to smile, but behind his eyes, a flicker. Something unreadable. She didn't see it then, but it was there. The ultrasound room was dim, monitors beeped. Grace squeezed Logan's hand. A faint whoosh echoed, then another and another. The nurse smiled gently. You're having triplets. Grace gasped, covered her mouth. Logan blinked, then stared at the screen. 3 heartbeats flickering, tiny, alive. She turned to him, teary-eyed. Did you hear that? 3. He forced a nod, but his grip loosened. That's a lot, he said quietly. She laughed nervously. We'll figure it out. Together, right? He didn't answer right away. Just kept looking at the screen. The nurse left. The door clicked shut. Silence filled the room. Heavy, dense. Grace reached for his hand again, but his palm was cold. The coffee had gone cold. Grace sat across from Logan at their kitchen table, holding the first printed scan. She smiled. I've been looking at daycare options just to prepare. Logan didn't respond. He stared at the photo, then leaned back, arms crossed. You're moving too fast, he said flatly. Her smile faded. We're having children, Logan? This is real. He scoffed. We made a mistake, one mistake. Now I'm locked in for life? Grace blinked. What did you just say? I didn't sign up for 3 kids. I'm not ruining my future because you forgot to take a pill. Her breath caught. He stood. I won't let this derail me. I won't do it. Grace clutched her stomach, shaking, silent. Something broke in her that day, and he didn't even look back. The rain came hard that night, sideways wind, soaking through everything. Grace stood at the top of the apartment steps, a suitcase by her feet, a trash bag in her arms. The door shut behind her. Logan didn't say goodbye. Her sweatshirt clung to her body. 7 months pregnant, no car, no plan. She pulled the hood over her head, bent down, picked up the ultrasound photo that had fallen. It stuck to her wet hand. She didn't let go. Cars passed. No one stopped. She walked. Slowly, 1 step at a time. Water pooled in her shoes. No messages, no calls, just her and the storm. The world had gone silent, except for her own heartbeat and the quiet rhythm of 3 lives growing inside her. Streetlights flickered above her. Rain kept falling, cold, unforgiving. Grace moved down the sidewalk, one hand gripping her belly. The other pulled a broken suitcase behind her. The wheels caught on cracks. She dragged it anyway. Her clothes were soaked through. Hair plastered to her face, every step slower than the last. A bus splashed water across her legs. She didn't flinch, didn't stop. No coat, no home, no one waiting. She passed a diner, lights warm inside. She looked in, families laughing. Dry, safe. She kept walking, eyes forward. Inside her, 3 heartbeats pushed back against the cold, so she kept going, because she had no choice. Grace must have found the shelter under a bus stop. Plastic bench, cold steel, rain still dripping from her sleeves. She placed the suitcase beside her, closed her eyes, listened to the sound of passing cars. Her stomach tightened. The babies shifted. She placed both hands over them. A couple across the street argued. A child cried from an upstairs window. Somewhere life moved on without her. She exhaled, shivering, then whispered aloud like a promise. I don't know where I'm going. She looked down at her belly, but I'm not falling apart. A bus passed. She didn't wave. She wasn't ready to ride. But she knew she wouldn't stay stuck here. Not like this, not for long. She collapsed near a crosswalk. Someone called 911. Grace woke up to sirens. Bright lights, pain burning low and sharp. The paramedic's voice was urgent. She's bleeding. Fast. Get the line in. She couldn't speak. Her lips moved, but no sound came. The pain grew heavier. Everything blurred. She clutched her stomach. Save them, she tried to say. Please, save them. A tear rolled past her temple as her eyes faded to gray. Someone held her hand in the ambulance. You're strong, the voice said. You hold on, Mama. They need you. But she was slipping, and for the first time Grace thought, maybe I won't make it. The room was quiet. Machines hummed low, steady. 3 incubators stood side by side, each held a tiny life. Eyes closed, wires taped to soft skin, breathing tubes, monitors blinking. Grace lay nearby, oxygen mask over her face, arms limp at her sides. A nurse adjusted one of the tubes, checked the babies, then glanced at Grace, still unconscious. Outside the window, dawn was breaking, but inside everything stood still. No flowers, no visitors, no father pacing the floor, just one woman, and 3 fragile beginnings behind glass. One beep echoed louder than the rest. Grace stirred, barely. Eyes cracked open. She turned her head, saw them, and began to cry silently, alone. Maggie Davis walked the maternity ward every Sunday. Retired Army, widowed, quiet eyes. She brought warm socks and soft blankets. That morning she stopped outside room 4. 3 babies. 1 woman, no flowers, no family. Grace was awake, barely, her eyes hollow, her body still weak. Maggie stepped inside, laid a blanket over her legs, didn't ask questions, didn't need to. Grace looked at her, confused. You don't know me. Maggie smiled. No, but I've been where you are. She didn't stay long, just long enough to refill the water, adjust a blanket, hold her hand. Then she left a card on the table. Maggie Davis, Veteran Outreach. We help the ones no one sees. Grace stared at it. Didn't pick it up, not yet. 3 weeks later, Grace stood on Maggie's porch. 1 duffel bag, a folded stroller, no questions asked. Maggie opened the door, already holding a baby bottle. Come in. You're not doing this alone anymore. The house smelled like cinnamon and old books. Warm, quiet, safe. Grace tucked the girls into a shared crib, sat on the couch, shoulders heavy. Maggie handed her tea. You ever think about the military? She asked. Grace blinked. Me, I'm just a mess. No, Maggie said it. You're a mother. You've survived more than most cadets ever will. She explained a logistics program, training, housing, childcare. You'd learn fast, get paid, and build something solid. Grace didn't answer. She just stared at the wall, holding that thought like a lifeline. It was the first time in months she didn't feel completely alone. Grace sat at the kitchen table, papers in front of her. Training schedule, childcare plan, military entry form. Maggie cooked in silence. Didn't push, didn't ask. Grace looked toward the hallway. 3 bassinets, soft breathing. I don't know if I can leave them, she said quietly. I don't know if I'm built for this. Maggie poured coffee. You're already doing the hardest job there is. Grace traced the edge of the form. What if I fail? Maggie shrugged. What if you don't? Grace didn't sleep that night. She held Harper close, listened to Olivia snore, while watched Chloe stretch her tiny fingers in a dream. At sunrise, she signed the form, hands shaking, heart steady, not for herself, but for them. Mud clung to her boots, rain mixed with sweat. Grace gritted her teeth and pushed the tire forward. It rolled 2 feet, stopped. She pushed again. Other recruits passed her, younger, faster. But she didn't stop. Her breath came in short bursts. Her arms shook. Every inch of her body screamed. Keep moving, Miller, the instructor yelled. She nodded, didn't speak, pushed again. The tire flipped. Behind her, water soaked the field. Ahead, more mud, more pain. But she kept going, not for a rank, not for pride. Every push whispered, for Olivia, for Chloe, for Harper. She didn't win that day, but she finished. And that was enough. The house was quiet, only the hum of the fridge and the soft ticking clock. Grace sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, training manual marked with notes, eyes heavy, shoulders as low. Harper stirred in her lap. Grace rocked her gently with one arm while typing with the other. A bottle stood half empty beside her, cold coffee untouched. She read the same sentence 3 times, then leaned forward, forehead resting on her hand. Her breath slowed. The baby's fingers curled around her sleeve. Grace didn't move. She couldn't. But before drifting off, she whispered into the dark, "I won't quit, no matter how slow this gets." Outside, the world slept. Inside, one mother headed through exhaustion. Because giving up was never an option. The radar system was down, techs were scrambling. The lieutenant paced, frustrated. Grace stood nearby, off shift, holding a clipboard, watching. She stepped closer, pointed at a loose wire. "Has anyone checked the relay switch?" They ignored her. She moved in anyway, pulled off her gloves, opened the panel, 2 minutes, click, reconnect, reset. The screen blinked, signal restored, silence. Then applause from the corner. The lieutenant stepped forward. "You've done this before?" Grace shook her head. "No, just read the manual, twice." He stared, then smiled. "Report to systems training tomorrow. You've got something." Grace walked away without saying more. But inside, something shifted. She wasn't just surviving now. She was building. Maggie slid a folder across the table. "MIT has a remote tech program. Military sponsorship. You qualify." Grace didn't touch it. She stared at the cover like it wasn't meant for her. "I didn't even finish college, she said. Maggie nodded. "Still doesn't change what you've got." Grace opened the folder slowly. Curriculum, timeline, full scholarship. "You fixed a radar that 3 certified techs couldn't touch," Maggie added. "That's not luck, that's aptitude." Grace ran a finger along the MIT seal. Something stirred. Hope. Maybe fear. Later that night, she watched her daughter sleep, 3 small chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. She whispered, "If I do this, it changes everything." In the morning, she filled out the first application page. Hands steady, she was ready to learn like her life depended on it, because now it did. The deposit hit at 6:03 a.m. Grace checked twice to be sure. It was real. Her first paycheck. She didn't buy shoes. Didn't go out. She went straight to the toy aisle at the base store. 3 small teddy bears, 1 puzzle mat, and matching socks in pastel colors. At checkout, her hands shook slightly. The cashier smiled. "New mom?" Grace nodded, eyes glassy. "Yeah, real new." That night, the girls played on the floor, hugging the bears. Harper giggled for the first time. Olivia rolled over. Chloe squealed. Grace sat back against the wall, watching, breathing it in. No awards, no headlines, just 3 babies. Safe, fed, loved. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was doing something right. 5 years later. Grace stood in a glass-walled office. City skyline behind her. 3 monitors blinked with live security feeds. A nameplate on her desk read, "Grace Miller, founder and CEO, Verity Defense Systems." Her inbox overflowed. Government contracts, hospital bids. She had teams on 3 continents, AI systems protecting lives she'd never meet. A photo sat by her keyboard. 3 girls, smiling in matching dresses. A knock at the door. "Ma'am, your presentation's in 10. Grace closed her laptop, straightened her blazer, nodded. She passed the mirror on the way out. Saw herself, strong, certain, built, not broken. The world had once shut its doors. Now it called her name. She didn't chase success. She created it, and she made it answer to her. Saturday morning, pancakes on the stove, laptops open on the table. Olivia, age 10, typed quietly, building a simple game from scratch. Chloe sketched app screens beside her, clean, intuitive. Harper practiced a speech in front of the fridge. "Good morning, my name is Harper Miller, and I believe kindness scales." Grace watched from the doorway. No makeup, coffee in hand, heart full. They weren't just growing, they were thriving. Every bedtime story, every science kit, every late-night project, they had absorbed it all. She didn't push them toward success. She showed them what was possible. They followed her not out of fear, but because they saw what strength with heart looked like. Grace smiled to herself. Her company was building code. But these 3, they were building legacy. The ballroom was packed. Hundreds of seats, dozens of cameras. Every major tech CEO in the country was in the room. A large banner stretched above the stage. "Future secure, innovating for tomorrow." Backstage, Grace adjusted the pin on her lapel. Black suit, hair tied back, eyes steady. An aide whispered, You're on in 30. She nodded once. No nerves, just focus. As her name was announced, the crowd clapped. She stepped into the lights, each footstep sharp, grounded. She reached the podium, waited for silence, then looked out. Somewhere in the back, a familiar face turned. Logan Walker. But Grace didn't flinch, not even a blink. This was her moment, not revenge, recognition, and she earned every second of it. Logan sat in the front row, wrinkled collar, eyes sunken, hands tapping restless on his knee. His company, once a rising star, was bleeding capital. Investors had pulled out. His second marriage ended 6 months ago. He wasn't on the speaker list. He came to network, to pitch, to beg. He flipped through his notes, eyes darting to the stage. Then he heard it. Her name. Grace Miller. He looked up slowly and froze. There she was, commanding the room he once ruled. No panic, no rush, no apology. He leaned forward, as if that could erase everything. Around him, people whispered, "Isn't that Logan Walker?" He used to be something. He kept his eyes on her, but the weight of her silence was louder than any deal he could close. The spotlight hit her face. Grace stood tall behind the podium. Black suit, still, certain. Her voice rang out, measured, confident, as resilience isn't born, it's built, and sometimes, rebuilt. Logan stared up, unmoving, mouth slightly open, hands frozen around his pen. He hadn't recognized the name. Not at first, but now there was no doubt. It was her, the woman he left in the rain. The one he once called too small for his future. People clapped as she spoke, but he didn't hear them. He only saw her eyes, focused, clear, and not looking at him once. She didn't need to. She already said everything without a word. In that moment, Logan realized she hadn't just survived. She had surpassed him. He waited near the elevator, hands shaking, tie loosened. When Grace stepped out, he spoke before thinking. "Grace, please, She paused, looked at him, not angry, not soft, just still. "I know this doesn't fix anything," he said quietly. "But I was wrong. About all of it. About you." She said nothing. Let silence hold him there. "I thought leaving you would make me free. It didn't. It broke me." His voice cracked. "I lost everything, and you became everything I wasn't brave enough to be." Grace looked down, then met his eyes. He expected rage, he expected shame, but she gave him neither, just a breath and one line. "I know." Then she turned and walked away, and he didn't follow. He couldn't. She stopped halfway down the hall, turned back. He was still standing there, small, quiet. Grace took a slow step toward him. Not for him, for herself. "I don't hate you," she said. Her voice was calm, clear. "I don't need you to suffer." She paused. "But I need you to know your choices didn't break me." Logan lowered his eyes. "I forgave you a long time ago," she added. Then with a steady breath, "But I didn't forget." Her words landed like stone, not sharp, just final. "I carried the weight you dropped, and I built something from it." She offered a nod. Not of peace, but of power. Then she walked away. No more to say. Nothing left to prove. The backyard was quiet. Afternoon sun filtered through the trees. A blanket spread across the grass. Grace sat with a book in her lap. Olivia leaned against her shoulder. Chloe traced patterns in the dirt. Harper held a stuffed bear half asleep. Their hair caught the light. Their laughter came in waves soft and small. Grace turned a page, read aloud, slow and steady. The girls listened, safe, warm, still children. No deadlines, no screens, just breath, sun, and the sound of a mother reading. She looked at them one by one, strong, whole, free. Grace smiled, quiet and full. This moment wasn't loud. But it was everything. All the struggle, all the nights alone led to this. A moment where nothing hurt and everything mattered. The story ended. Grace closed the book and set it aside. Harper rolled onto her back, stared at the skate, then spoke softly. "Mom, do you ever wish Dad was still here?" Grace didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the leaves. A bird chirped in the distance. Chloe sat up. Olivia looked away. Even at their age, they understood the weight in that question. Grace brushed Harper's hair back gently, searched her daughter's face. She didn't want to lie, didn't want to speak too soon. She took a breath, held it, then looked up at the sky with her girls beside her, and said nothing, yet. Grace finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but clear. "If your father hadn't left," she said, "I wouldn't have learned how strong I really am." The girls stayed quiet, not confused, just listening. I thought I needed someone beside me to survive, but I didn't. I needed to believe in myself. She looked at each of them. You didn't just make me a mother. You made me grow. You made me fight. Harper leaned closer. Would you change anything? Grace smiled. No, not a thing. She picked up the book again, held it with steady hands. Success wasn't the company. It wasn't the paycheck. It was this raising daughters who asked brave questions, and being strong enough to answer with truth. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, and it all came back. The ambulance lights, her hands reaching for life through pain, the long nights at Maggie's, the bottles, the books, the silence, boots in mud, pushing tires, gritting her teeth, refusing to stop, fingers on a keyboard at 2 a.m., feeding babies between code modules, the radar fix, the letter from MIT, the first contract signed in a borrowed suit. Then, the stage, the lights. The man who once walked away now sitting in silence, watching her lead, each moment small on its own, but together. They built a woman who never broke. She opened her eyes. The girls were still beside her, still listening, still hers. Grace stood up, folded the blanket. The girls ran ahead, laughing through the grass. She watched them. Strong, loud, unafraid. They didn't know the whole story yet, but one day they would. They'd know what it took, what it cost, and why she never gave up. Because strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, soft-spoken, steady, unshakable. Now it's your turn. You've heard their story. You've seen both paths. So choose. Do you stand with Grace from who rose from nothing and built everything? Or with Logan, who had it all and walked away? Comment below. I choose resilience. Because sometimes the strongest people are the ones who were never supposed to make it, but did.